Hello, our presentation is on Native American Heritage Month. November is recognized as Native American Heritage Month here in the United States. For our presentation, we will explore 5 parts: common terminology to be aware of, a brief history of Native peoples here in the U.S., debunking misconceptions and myths, go over current events and issues Indigenous people in the U.S. face, and finally, how we can continue the learning moving forward. But before we move on to the presentation, there are some things to remember. In the Americas, there is vast cultural diversity among more than 2,000 tribal groups. Tribes have unique cultures and ways of life that span history from time immemorial to the present day. There is no single language or culture shared by all Indigenous Americans, or even Indigenous people of the shared world. There are many similarities shared, along with many differences. Interactions with Europeans and Americans brought accelerated and often devastating changes to American Indian cultures, and Native people continue to fight to maintain the integrity and viability of Indigenous societies. American Indian history is one of culture persistence, creative adaptation, renewal, and resilience.
The origin of the term American Indian is from the time of Columbus and his explorations. His original goal was to find a quicker trade route with India than the Silk Road. Thus, he was convinced that the people he encountered were in fact Indians. This term has specific legal context in the US and is used in federal Indian law and by the US Census Bureau. Fun fact: an Indian American is the term used to refer to people who live in the US and have Indian ancestry. The term Native American came into use in the 1960s to replace American Indian because it was a misnomer and sometimes carried racist connotations. However, the term Native American has fallen out of favor with some groups due to its broadness. For example, Native American is traditionally used to refer to all Indigenous people in North, Central, and South America. So, if someone with Native ancestry moves to the US from South America, they are grouped under the term Native American. Because of this, tribes registered within the US prefer the term American Indian due to its legal context and inclusivity. First Nations is a term used to describe Indigenous people in Canada who are not Métis or Inuit. First Nations people are original inhabitants of the land that is now Canada and were the first to encounter sustained European contact, settlement, and trade. Symbolically, the term elevates First Nations to the status of first among equals, alongside the English and French as founding nations of Canada. It is also reflective of the sovereign nature of many communities and the ongoing quest of self-determination and for self-government. The term is not used by Indigenous people outside of Canada. People in many parts of the Arctic consider Eskimo a derogatory term because it was given to them by colonizers. Many people also thought it meant an eater of raw meat, which connotated barbarism and violence. Although the word's exact etymology is unclear, mid-century anthropologists suggest the word came from the Latin word excommunicati, meaning the excommunicated ones, because the native people of the Canadian Arctic were not Christian. The word's racist history means most people in Alaska, Canada, and Greenland still prefer other terms. The most widespread is Inuit, which simply means people, or Native Alaskan when referring to those in the state. Indigenous, which refers to people with pre-existing sovereignty who lived together communally before contact with settler populations, is the most inclusive of these terms. The United Nations recognizes it as a global term that describes the shared political identity of Native people around the world. Keep in mind, there is no simple answer for political correctness to refer to Native Americans and Indigenous people. Similar to racial and ethnic identities, it's very intricate but extremely significant. Although most of the terms are generally accepted, if it is possible, refer to the Native people by their tribe, for example, the Seminole tribe.
With over 574 federally recognized American Indian tribes and villages and over 200 different languages, there are some cultural commonalities that are specific to Native and Indigenous people. For example, crucial components of Native tribes include the passing down of oral history through storytelling, as well as dance and song. There is also a shared respect for nature and the importance of the land. Throughout their long histories, Indigenous peoples in the Americas have thrived on, respected, and protected the environments that make up their homelands and continue to value being good stewards of the environment. Because of this, Indigenous peoples in the Americas have been innovative and successful managers of their lands and resources for tens of thousands of years. Their innovations are deeply anchored in a carefully attuned relationship with the land. Today, these teachings and technologies present sustainable solutions to modern day issues, such as Inca agricultural terraces that limit land usage and maximize water distribution, and lowering the amounts of fossil fuels, water, and pollution from industrial farms. For a millennia, American Indians have shaped and been shaped by their culture and environment. Elders in each generation teach the next generation their values, traditions, and beliefs through their own tribal languages, social practices, arts, music, ceremonies, and customs.
Indigenous people have lived in the Western Hemisphere for at least 15 to 20,000 years. These cultures were diverse, well-developed, and complex societies that interacted with one another over millennia. They practiced diplomacy, waged wars, built alliances, and built vast trade networks that spanned the continent. It is estimated that in the 130 years following first contact, Native America lost 95% of its population. An example of the complex political systems already in place pre-European contact is the Iroquois or Haudenosaunee Confederacy, founded in 1142. The Confederacy consisted of originally 5, later 6, separate nations united by the Great Law of Peace. Each nation maintained its own leadership, but common causes were decided in the Grand Council of Chiefs. Their constitution outlines the balance of power between the Confederacy and individual tribes, the 2 branches of legislature, explains the process for passing laws, delineates how to remove a leader, who has the power to declare war, and restricts members from holding more than one office. Any of this sound familiar? In 1988, the US Senate passed a resolution to acknowledge the contribution of the Iroquois Confederacy to the development of the United States Constitution. Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, and the other framers of the Constitution are known to have greatly admired the concepts of the Confederacy and incorporated many of its democratic principles into the Constitution itself. After the colonies became a country and the country began to grow, a variety of historical policy periods have had a major impact on the American Indian people's abilities to self-govern. This first era is the removal period.
Signed into law in 1830 by President Andrew Jackson, the Indian Removal Act provided for the general resettlement of Native Americans from east of the Mississippi River to lands of the West. In this video, the Cherokee Nation was removed to reservations in what has been called the Trail of Tears.
The various Indian tribes that were present in the United States were recognized as separate independent nations in the Constitution itself. So going back to the founding of the country, they were recognized as separate nations. They were not subject to state law. Treaties could not be made with states. They had to be made with the federal government because it was government to government relation, nation to nation, just like the US to Germany or any other country. So they kept passing repeated laws trying to take the land away from the Cherokee. They were not recognized as legal, but once Jackson was president, he supported the removal of the Indians. The Cherokee argued through the Supreme Court. They always tried to follow the legal procedure, fit in as Americans. They took 2 cases to the Supreme Court that ruled that they could not be removed. They had the right to the land, but the president ignored the Supreme Court and ordered the Army to forcibly remove the Cherokee from all of the area. Some leaders of the Cherokee signed the Treaty of Neoshoto, which was validated by the President and Congress, which gave away the rest of the remaining lands in the state. Others didn't agree with that, didn't want to accept it. But even the ones who didn't want to accept it, once the president had ordered the removal, let everyone know they should not violently resist. They should go along when the time came. In addition to the Army, Georgia mobilized its militia and sent them in to assist with the removal, which is one of the reasons that the leaders encouraged people not to resist. There's a fear that if people did start resisting, there'd be a mass slaughter. The process of the removal became known as the Trail of Tears. The Army and the militias literally went house to house on the Cherokee Nation, grabbing everyone who was there and marching them away. Generally, they weren't even given time to pack bags. They were just taken. They were marched to gathering camps. There were several throughout the state, kept there until everyone in the area had been gathered up. And then they were moved to major transportation centers. And then primarily by overland, they walked all the way to Oklahoma. They've called this the Trail of Tears because of all the deaths and all the suffering that happened. There were approximately 18,000 Cherokee that were gathered up and removed during the Trail of Tears, and at least 4,000 of them died on the trip to Oklahoma from Georgia and North Carolina. It still is a very significant moment in their history, and it's hard for some of them to even speak of, even after all this time.
Beginning in the late 1800s, the US government changed tactics from removal and moved towards assimilation. The Encyclopedia Britannica defines assimilation as follows. Assimilation in anthropology and sociology is the process whereby individuals or groups of differing ethnic heritage are absorbed into the dominant culture of a society. Measures taken during this period include the 1887 Dawes Act that reallotted Native American land and the Bureau of Indian Affairs' 1902 Haircut Order, specifying that men with long hair couldn't receive rations. The US backed the opening of boarding schools, beginning the practice of forcibly separating Native American children from their parents. Nearly 150 boarding schools were opened around the country, all founded on the objective to kill the Indian in him and save the man. At these boarding schools, staff forced Indigenous students to cut their hair and use new Anglo-American names. They forbid children from speaking their native languages and observing their religious and cultural practices. By removing them from their homes, the schools disrupted students' relationships with their families and other members of their tribes. Once they returned home, children struggled to relate to their families after being taught that it was wrong to speak their language or practice their religion. Boarding schools were susceptible to deadly infections like tuberculosis and the flu, and these schools, such as the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, had cemeteries for dead students. Between Carlisle's founding in 1879 and its closing in 1918, the school buried nearly 200 children in its cemetery. The students who did survive these schools were marked by trauma. A citizen of the Oneida Nation explains that the boarding school experience helps explain why many Indigenous languages are now endangered or even dead. As an example, he points to his great-grandparents' generation who attended these boarding schools. My grandmother recalled hearing the Oneida language being spoken around her by the people who were the adults, but they chose not to teach it to children, he says. Why? Because it was a source of trauma for them, and they had been told that it was backwards, that it was uncivilized, that it was of the past, that there was no utility in speaking it.
On June 18, 1934, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Indian Reorganization Act. It improved the political, economic, and social conditions of American Indians in a number of ways. Privatization was terminated, some of the land taken was returned, and new land could be purchased with federal funds. A policy of tribal self-government was implemented. Tribes were allowed to incorporate businesses and credit established to further such businesses, and education and employment opportunities were greatly enhanced. While there were some problems with the law, particularly in its implementation, it showed some significant successes. The Indian termination policy was intended to assimilate Native Americans as individuals as opposed to one ethnic group into mainstream Western civilization. It was established by Congress as a means of ending all relations between Native American tribes and the federal government. The termination policy was intended to grant all the privileges and rights of citizenship to the Native Americans. However, it actually ended tribe sovereignty and freedom, trusteeship of the reservations, and exclusion of Indians from state laws. In addition, Native Americans also had to deal with taxes and state laws, which they were previously exempt from. While the 1960s and 70s are known for the fight for civil rights, rights for women, Chicana rights, and many more, this era also included the Red Power movement. The American Indian Movement was one of the organizations created to promote and protest for the protection of treaty rights and the preservation of spirituality and culture. They have helped to restore spiritual leaders and elders to their former positions of esteem for the wisdom and the history they hold. In 1969, they were involved in an occupation of Alcatraz. The intention of the invasion was to demand attention to the health, educational, employment, and cultural needs of Indians, and especially the lack of social services available for off-reservation Indians. Of major import were religious freedom, guaranteed to all citizens under the Constitution, the return of ancestral artifacts, and the continued desecration of Indian burial sites. Policies during this time were the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act of 1976, which established American Indians' legal rights to health care, maintaining that they are eligible for Medicare, Medicaid, and Veterans Administration benefits on the same basis as other citizens, as well as the 1978 Indian Child Welfare Act, designed to stop removal of Indian children from reservations by state welfare agencies and state courts. It is estimated that 30% of Indian children were placed with non-Indian families between the 1920s and the time that the bill was passed.
These are some common questions and myths that we would like to debunk, since the intersection of federal, state, and tribal laws can be complicated and sometimes misrepresented. First off, American Indians and Native Alaskans are American citizens. They have the right to vote in federal and tribal elections as long as they are eligible. They are also able to hold public office. The U.S. House of Representatives will have its highest number of Indigenous representatives after 6 candidates were elected or re-elected in the November 4th, 2020 election. They represent the Laguna and Jemez Pueblo, Ho-Chunk, Chickasaw, Cherokee, and Native Hawaiian peoples. American Indians and Native Alaskans must pay taxes, with a few exceptions to sales and income taxes on Indian reservations or trust land. All federal, state, and local laws apply to those who live outside of reservations. On federal Indian reservations, however, only federal and tribal laws apply to the members of the tribe unless Congress has provided otherwise. Any special rights held by federally recognized tribes and their members are generally based on treaties or other agreements between the tribes and the United States. The heavy price American Indians and Alaskan Natives paid to retain certain rights of self-government was to relinquish much of their land and resources to the United States. U.S. law protects the inherent rights they did not relinquish. Among those may be hunting and fishing rights and access to sacred sites. We are now going to move on to some current events and issues that face Indigenous people here in the United States and Canada. First off, we will discuss murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. Second, we will talk about changing the narrative. And third, we will talk about Native youth and reclaiming pride and cultural knowledge. In 2012, the Grand Chief of MKO, Sheila North Wilson, coined the hashtag MMIW, an abbreviation of Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women. Girls have now been added to this, so the hashtag has become MMIWG. This has sparked a national inquiry in Canada of murdered and missing Indigenous women in 2016 through 2017, and since then there has been an increase in research and cries for justice. In a 2016 report by the National Crime Information Center, there were 5,712 reported cases of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, but only 116 of those reports were logged in the U.S. Department of Justice database. The CDC found that the third leading cause of death among Native and Indigenous women is murder. Reasons prior for the lack of quality data include underreporting, racial misclassification, poor relationships between law enforcement and American Indian and Alaskan Native communities, poor record-keeping protocols, institutional racism in the media, and a lack of substantive relationships between journalists and Indigenous communities. This is a human rights crisis that has heavily affected Native and Indigenous communities across North America. Women as young as 15 are likely to experience racialized or sexualized violence. Gathering the statistics surrounding murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls is difficult and unclear due to vague documentation and underreporting. This continues to be an issue due to the overlapping of determinants, such as the role of misogyny and racism that perpetuates violence against Native and Indigenous women, disparities in women's rights, historical context of assimilation, and the removal of Native and Indigenous families and communities.
Reclaiming Native Truth, a platform focused on fostering cultural, social, and policy change by empowering Native Americans, has put an effort to create a movement of movements approach to advance a new narrative that promotes systemic and cultural changes. This movement of movements recognizes, respects, and links the existing narrative, change, work, and efforts of many Native and non-Native allies around a unifying new narrative. Reclaiming Native Truth revealed 4 key themes that need to be part of the new narrative. First is values. Native values of family, connection to the land, and respect for culture and tradition are understood and highly respected by non-Native Americans. Linking to these values creates a connection and builds understanding. Illustrating how these values are present today helps prevent a slip into historic, romanticized ideas of Native cultures. Second is history. Research shows that most non-Native people do not fully understand the true histories of Native Americans and nations, are open to learning, and feel frustrated when they realize that what they were taught in school was false or incomplete. Weaving in facts, not too many, but a few to get the conversation started about Native Americans' histories makes people more receptive to hearing more and more willing to act on many issues of importance to Native Americans. Third is visibility. History must be directly linked to contemporary life. This shows 2 things. 1, that Native Americans' cultures and contributions are vital parts of modern life. And 2, that injustices continue today. Because many non-Native Americans don't know or don't realize they know any Native Americans, highlighting Native people's involvement in every aspect of modern life helps people to move past the systemic erasure and stereotypes and to see what is true today. And fourth is call to action. The other central piece of the narrative is a strong call to action or request for people to do something. It will vary depending on the audience and the issue, but it should be clear, specific, and inviting.
Many communities have sought in the 20th and 21st centuries to revitalize and reclaim their languages and cultures. The use of social media, especially, has paved ways for Native and Indigenous communities to create new narratives. Platforms such as Instagram or TikTok are an opportunity for Native and Indigenous youths and young adults to share their culture, connect with others, and inform people of the misconceptions, stereotypes, or gaps in their culture and history. Native and Indigenous communities have put immense effort into making themselves visible in today's societies. The hope to break down stereotypes, reframe the narrative, and to seek out social justice are just a few crucial ways Native and Indigenous people are presenting themselves today. We hope that with this presentation and the accompanying handout, we all will continue to learn more about this population as a whole.